All right, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Magduit, and today my goal is going to be to show you how I go about sampling. More accurately, refining your samples and maybe organizing them in a way that's a little bit more useful in both your future projects and others potentially if you want to, you know, distribute your own samples or sell them. So, I haven't seen a lot of tutorial videos on this, so especially within FL Studio that are up to date. So I kind of want to just go through maybe my process and see if that helps anyone out there who is interested in trying to, create their own sample packs and accumulate their own library of sounds. These are some examples as well. I'll just show you maybe of what I was working on yesterday, for example. And they're just very interesting sounds that I really enjoy, and I wanted to be more um, cut up into useful and enjoyable pieces. So, with all of that said, let's go and get into the process of sampling. So, what I have right here is a audio file. It is a pretty long audio file. It is a jam of a bunch of different random stuff that I was working on my OP1 the other day, and I have just brought it into FL Studio and I recorded it into FL Studio actually with the built-in record audio option here. And I had my OP1 hooked up to my interface, and I was basically just recording directly into whatever channel. Um, and yeah, so let's just go through this sound. What we're gonna do is just select maybe like three or four different little tidbits that are good to us that or to me rather that I enjoy listening to, and that way we'll basically kind of narrow down the smorgasbord of sounds here into a more cohesive and preferential sound palette, you could say. So let's just go ahead and start looking for good sounds. Kind of like that one. Let's go ahead and cut that bad boy out. It's a cool snare. And what I'm doing here is I'm just using the slice tool and the slip tool. So I'm basically just slicing up the parts that I like. And I'm not really caring too much about if they're lined up with anything, or I'm not really worried about the volume automating or anything like that. I'm just kind of looking for the specific samples that I like, that I want to try using in a track later on. So let's keep going. It's a pretty cool little kick. As you can hear, these are more. So the previous little thing I was showing you, these are more like just regular percussion, but I actually wanted to try and flesh out some more of my, traditional percussive areas. So I'm kind of mainly working on kick snares, maybe some clappy, hi-hatty sounds. Ooh, it's actually a nice, noisy little hat right there. It's kind of an all right open hi-hat, but I think I'm going to keep looking for. Just going to get pickier here. It's an interesting little kick. All right, we'll grab one more. We're getting already to the point where we've got quite a few little samples here. We'll get one more sample. We'll make this an impact. It's a cool little impact there. All right. So, I'm going to actually just kind of set this off to the side here and mute it because I do want to keep working on it and not lose my place. But let me also just save this real fast as my sample pack sound design file. All right. So, sorry, I'm just trying to zoom in here. So we basically got our sounds that we've selected. And I mean, you could, in theory, just make unique as sample right now and not do any post processing. and you'll probably have a pretty cool sample pack. I wouldn't doubt that. But I like to kind of just doctor up these samples a little bit, make them a little bit more unique and interesting and timbrally deep, I guess, is probably the best word to describe what I enjoy doing with these sounds. And basically what that involves is me just first organizing them into a more cohesive way and then affecting them with different effects. So let's just start by organizing. So what I'm doing here is I'm zooming in and I have the magnet tool selected on none and I'm using my slip tool and I'm basically just zooming in really far and I'm slowly moving the audio so that it lines up with the start point of each of these little clips. And the reason why I do this is just because it makes it easier for me to automate and just use the grid to my advantage. We're just going to make sure that for areas like this, we're just making sure that we're trimming off anything that could be the start of a next sample or something like that. And the way I did that, by the way, is I just held control. And if you have something selected when you have the slip tool, you can use the slip tool to trim the ends of the audio clips here. So I'm just kind of going through and trimming these bad boys. Let me just make sure that all of these are perfectly placed. When I say perfect, nothing's perfect, but I'm trying my best here. So there we go. We've got, what is that? 6 pretty good samples. Okay, so like I said, you could probably export those as is and be totally fine. But, whoops, let me make sure we've got line and the pencil tool selected, and we're just going to go, oh, okay. I guess because it's already selected, it won't. There we go. All right, so the reason why I do all of this is because then I can just kind of have these all on their own little individual grid line. And I kind of think of that as like my box for working with them. if that makes sense. So basically for each of these I'm going to have like a selection made, and then whenever I do bounce to audio, I'm just going to be rendering just that small section of the timeline instead of all of these other sections. So first, when it comes to the post-processing of all these sounds, what I do is route the master track. So basically, these are all cut up, but they still belong to this big file that we started with, which is good. We kind of like that because what that means is we can just route this big file to track 1, and then this will be our initial bus. This will just be like the first kind of place where sounds go. And what's cool about that is now all of these are linked to that channel rack because I mean we haven't made these unique in any way. They're all from the same exact sample. So it's useful. So basically after you have that set up and you have it routed to the first track, then you can start affecting things. So one of my first go-tos, and this is just because I like to make the sounds a lot louder. Well, actually, here first. So I almost forgot. The first thing I do is after I have it linked to this track, depending on what I want to do with it, I'll either EQ it. In this case, I'm not going to because there's really not any. There's not a lot of muddiness. There's not a lot of like horrible sounds that I want to get rid of immediately. So what I'll do is just render this as is, so that way we have a individual audio file that is completely unique and doesn't have any of this extra stuff in its like information. And so I'll hopefully show you what that means right now. So basically, to sample inside of FL Studio, and this is like the main part of the video that I think I really wanted to make super clear. To sample in FL Studio, you basically just have to click on this little record button here. It's the arm button for whatever track that you want to sample from. And once you have it routed to that track and you have a time selection made, you can be in the mixer window and click the key combination on your keyboard, Alt and R at the same time. And it'll bring up this little rendering mixer track dialog window. And obviously you can, set up how much bit depth you want, resampling rate, all that kind of good shit. And you can make it so that it's just song selection or pattern. I'm obviously doing song selection. And I'm going to cut remainder for the tail because I've made sure that we're far past the end of the sample when it comes to our time selection. So we're good there. And yeah, you just click start, and it will render whatever it is that was going through that track as an audio file. So now we have an individual audio file, and the only thing in it is that sound. And the reason why that's important is because the next thing I like to do is make it really loud. The way to easily do that in FL Studio is just to normalize it. And we're just going to actually put this on a second track here because I want to show you how much louder it gets with the normalize. What normalize does is it basically puts the highest amplitude, sound. Usually that's the transient, and it puts it all the way up to 0 dB. So that way you're basically right before clipping. It's a compression. It's a type of compression basically where you're compressing it until it is essentially at 0 dB. So once you have that set up, I'll show you how loud it is. So as you can see, it gets pretty loud, but that's good. So the reason why I like to make things pretty loud is because usually when the way I look at samples that I'm trying to put into songs, I usually want to have more information than I need. So that usually means that I'm going to be cutting things away, turning things down, things like that. Maybe compressing things slightly, but maybe sometimes expanding things slightly. The big point is I try and have a sound that is not too quiet, because you don't want to be boosting things with EQs. You don't want to have to add gain boosting in your effects chains and things like that. So that's why I do this, and I'm just trying to help you understand why I do this in my process. Cymatics does a very similar thing. Same with Vengeance. They're all very, very much in the same line of thinking, where their sounds are very full, very bright, very loud, and that way when you do drag it into your track, you can then EQ that in a way that you want for your song. So that way maybe you don't want as much low end. At least the low end is there in the first place for you to cut away, instead of you having to be like, well, what if I want low end in this sound and there is none to begin with? So yeah, sorry for that little tangent. Just wanted to let you all know why this is such an important step, in my opinion. All right, so let's go ahead and get to work here. So the first thing that I usually throw on the track, just to have it on here, is this compressor from Native Instruments. Again, a lot of these things can be interchanged for other things, but basically all this is it's a vocal compressor that can reduce peaks. So this is incredibly useful for me when it comes to transient processing, because basically this is transient shaper, or transient processor, rather. It's the same kind of deal, except instead of it being a volume automation or whatever this is, I don't know what algorithm it technically uses, it's basically just a compressor. And what the compressor is doing is compressing the, or gain reducing, rather, the initial loud transients based on how much you have this, or how high you have this knob set to. And then you also can gain boost here if you so need. So basically what that does is it kind of sausages. It's hard to explain, but it basically makes the audio into more of a sausage than it having as much dynamic range. Sometimes that's important. Sometimes you want more dynamic range, but in these cases, I try and make these sounds like just super full, super like. So you'll see like the reduction in the peaks as you adjust this peak reduction knob. Obviously, you're just gain reducing, but basically what I usually do is I have this set at the end of my track, so that way whenever I'm finishing, I can just adjust this knob to where I want it, and that way I have basically still loud. We're still almost at 0 dB. We're still a little under. Every time I increase this, it does reduce the gain slightly. But my point is it's less aggressive, less painful on the transient. But depending on what you're going for, you may want to keep the peaks, but that's why I have this here, is just in case I can fine-tune it to exactly the way that I want it. So let's just have that at a reasonable position. All right. And then, after that, it's really all about just kind of going the more creative route with whatever it is that you're adding. So, for example, something that I sometimes will add is tape saturation. That's one of the big things that I really enjoy adding to a lot of my samples. and it just adds some warmth, depending on what it is, of course. It's barely audible in some cases, but let's see what without. Let's A/B it. It's obviously very hard to hear in this case, but um, usually what this does is it just rounds off some of the more digital edges if you're using a digital sound. But actually, this is a analog sound to begin with, so maybe that's why it's less apparent in this case. But I always like using tape saturation. You can also use the classic, I say classic, but the more popular, not Pro R. What am I doing here? I need Fab Filter, Saturn. There we go. You can also use Saturn as well. Similar vibes, just a little bit more precise, a little bit more digital sounding, in my opinion, but also still absolutely amazing. You can make some sounds brighter or duller with this, which is super useful. So, for example, I can use tube, maybe warm tube saturation, and really crank it on the high end, but leave the lower end kind of as is. You see, it kind of brings up that brightness. And yeah, and then we'll go ahead and maybe add some width to it. So depending on what it is, this is a kick technically, but we're gonna do some not so normal things here. This is not something you normally do, but I'm just showing you in general. Maybe this will be more of a percussive. Maybe we'll high pass this slightly, but adding some stereo width to some of your samples can be really cool. I've found that even with, for example, some of Virtual Riot's samples, or there's a bunch of people that do this, but having very stereo wide sounds, even if they are kicks or bass instruments, can be really cool and sound awesome. And depending on what you're using, you can do that without fucking with the phase, because the key is to keep the phase, you know, sane, in the sense that you don't want phase cancellation. You don't want these moments where you play your sound and it just disappears. So this little plugin right here, which is free, by the way, is one of my favorite go-tos for stereo width, because it doesn't mess with your phase at all. It is completely phase compatible, and it's really interesting because it's got these two little modes down here. You've got a lot of different options to basically fine-tune your width as well. So let's go ahead and make it wider. And you see you can get really crazy with it. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but I'm just saying, you know, it's the option is there. There we go. And what's cool is, like I said, this is mono compatible, so we can test this as well if you want to A/B. By just, let me close out of some of these other VSTs here. You can let me just do FX bus here as well. So you can use this knob right here to adjust the stereo separation to 100% merged, and that will allow you to A/B your stereo field. So if it sounds at least similar or just as good in both, then you're probably fine. So let's go ahead and check both of these. So this is stereo, this is mono, stereo, mono. Oh. And you can hear we're not really losing a whole lot. Obviously, you get a little bit more of space inside the more stereo version, but that's usually the vibe anyway. But in mono, you can hear the sound just as good. It sounds really clear. It sounds just the way it did before. And yeah, that's like the big point that is important to kind of hammer home in this little instance there. So once all of that is done, I will once again return to my VC2A. And I'll basically try and get it as loud as possible without being too harsh. And the last step, and this is an optional step, I would say, but I think it's one that I enjoy personally doing. And this is just because I find that with some of my samples, I do want to cut away what is there because they, that's more or less the artistic aspect of it all. So, depending on how loud or how muddy things sound, I will then, after all of this, EQ certain parts away that I do or dislike, or do or don't like rather. So, for example, if I play this out, we can see that there's some stuff down here that might not be necessary. There's also some really high end stuff that's like kind of ear piercing. So what I'll usually do is I'll just go through here and just kind of listen in to see what I need. And then do the same right here on the high end. And actually what it sounds like is that the real resonant-y stuff. And here we're just kind of taking out some of those resonant peaks that are quite harsh on the ears and just kind of, dulling them down a little bit. Not too much because I am a big firm believer of the sample should be good as is, more or less. You really don't want to do too much to it. But this is, again, just adding my own artistical part to the sound that I've recorded. Just, again, making it deeper than just a sound that I recorded. I think there are some effects that can be used, not sparingly, but they can be used tastefully and end up actually making the sound a lot more interesting and pleasurable right from the hit, like right from the get go, instead of making people do a bunch of work on their own end to basically get it to sound good. Whoops, I did not do this yet, but it sounded like there was something. All right, that's pretty good. So once all of that is done, I will then render this out. So let's do the old Alt R again, and we're gonna do the cut remainder again as well. All right, and now basically we have our finished file for the most part. What I like to do, and this is just probably overkill, but depending on what you're doing and which sample you're editing, and if you have any reverb or some kind of a tail that you're adding to the sound, I like to literally volume automate the sample to be exactly the way that I want it to sound, especially when it's cutting out on the end, because I want it to be a lot more smooth. So like without you can see that there's like less of a tail, and I mean, I guess I could leave this, right? There's nothing that's forcing me to cut this out. But the reason why I like doing this is because more often than not, from what I've been seeing nowadays, especially when I look at artists like Mr. Bill or Frequent or a lot of IDM and EDM producers, prefer shorter sounds. The shorter, the better, because the shorter the sound, the more room there is after the sound to add more stuff. So I usually try and make my samples relatively short, assuming, it's a percussive sample. This kind of changes when you're working with things like melodic instruments or vocals or bass sounds, because you really want to make sure that you get, everything that's important. But when it comes to percussion specifically, I prefer it to feel almost smooth. So we're going to go ahead and render that. And the way I render this is usually I will put it right to the end of the audio automation clip, and I'll just go in and render it one last time on the master fader. And then there you go. And that's it. So that is the final sample. And then what I do with that is I will make unique as sample. And I'll just go to my sample pack here. And yeah, we'll just go to like one shots. We'll make this a percussive sound again. And we'll just call this one like a laser. Thump perk. Yeah, sounds about right. Right? Yeah, that's what I would call it. So yeah, obviously this is the more creative part of coming up with names, but yeah. And that is the final sample. And that's just one sample. Now I know that seemed like a time-consuming, timely process. That's the word I was looking for there. But quite frankly, like the only reason why it takes so long when I'm explaining it is because I like to make sure that I explain everything in detail. But once you get into the swing of things, you can really start cranking these bad boys out. Like more often than not, I'll get through probably 30 to 40 samples a day. And that's just not really actively like working as hard as I possibly can, but taking like tons of breaks. Maybe when I have small moments of time where I can get like one or two samples finished, I'll just do that. And yeah, it's not that difficult. I've just heard a lot of people say that resampling in FL is kind of difficult and sampling in FL is kind of hard, and it doesn't make sense in comparison to things like Ableton. And quite frankly, I haven't had that issue, and I just wanted to kind of share my workflow because maybe this can help people who use FL Studio that want to start making their own sample packs and making cool sounds. So yeah, that's the main reason why. And yeah, let's just keep working. I'll do one more just to show you in a more quick way how this works out. Because once you have your FX bus set up, you can kind of reuse a lot of these settings, or potentially just use all the same plugins but just adjust them slightly. Usually the big thing that I adjust is the EQ at the end. I almost always change that. But some of these things I'll just leave the same, especially the tape. The tape saturation, I sometimes have to adjust the input gain, but like a lot of this stuff, it's more about just tweaking than re-adding. So let me just render this sample out, and we'll just try and do this as quickly as possible. See if we can get one done in a reasonable amount of time. So let's go ahead and listen to this without a lot of this stuff. Tape saturation slapping. Make sure there's a little bit. Make it a little bit brighter with the old Saturn. Get some stereo imaging in there. There we go. And then the last part, what I'll usually do is I'll just go up here and click clean on the presets, and then we'll go right back to the base setup for Pro Q3. And I'll try and EQ. I really want to get rid of some of this mud. Kind of make it more snare-like. And let's try and cut the high end. All right, now let's try and get, there's some voweliness that sounds muddy here. Should have that hitting that VC2A ever so slightly. If we're hitting it around -6 or higher, that's usually my lowest that I like to go, especially for snares. So yeah, and then we just render that out. Go back over here, create the automation clip for the volume. Set that up properly. Sometimes I will have to do this. And then just go over here and just make sure that the timeline is perfectly linked up with that. And then render it one last time from the master fader, and there you go. That's how you make a sample, and it's like that quick. So it isn't initially fast, but I think once you get things set up and you get into the swing of things, it gets easier. Plus, depending on what you're working on, you might want to change this effects bus. So sometimes what I'll do if I'm like working on a previous maybe a previous sample set that I've already kind of cut up and mangled a little bit, I will then add more effects onto this second channel. And I'll quickly just show you that real quick because I think it's some valuable information. So let me just quickly render this. And let's go back over here. And basically, when I normalize and link this to here, maybe this time I want to put on a little bit of room reverb. Let me just quickly set this back to default here. You can kind of see AB like without a lot of these effects versus with. It's just smoother. It's warmer. It feels better. I don't know how else to explain it. But yeah, let's go ahead and get some room reverb in here. Let's try to use, I don't know, let's use something spicy. Pro R's got some nice room reverbs. Maybe like a small drum room could be cool. Maybe a little bit smaller than that. Maybe just ambience, like kick ambience. I'm trying to just get a little bit, nothing crazy, but that should be good. And then maybe let's just EQ real quick here. And then maybe low pass. Now, this is just an idea, but sometimes what I will do is I'll cut out a lot of the high end on some of these transients. Maybe like right there. Maybe make it quite less aggressive as well. And then what I'll do is I'll put things like either corrosion, in Ableton, I think erosion is very similar, or... And as you can see, it kind of adds like that noisiness. You can change this as well from a stereo noise file to like a square wave. Kind of bit crush it. You can obviously set the frequency so that way it's in tune with this kick. Or you can have it basically make it tonal. But I'll do, we'll just do stereo noise. And usually I'll put this before everything, just to kind of make it, which means I have to put the EQ before everything as well. Another quick little thing that can help out, just to make sure you're not too loud. I really try and get this as close to 0 as possible without going over 0. And this is just a soft clipper indicator, basically. But I'm basically trying to make it so that it's literally not going over 0. So that way people can boost a little bit if they want. But my goal is always mainly to try and not force people, but get people into the mentality of cutting away from my samples, because They're so full. All right, now let's go and adjust the peak reduction. Just have it hitting a little bit. And sometimes if you want to make snappier sounds, this is not always the case, but sometimes you can use transient processor and then increase the attack. It doesn't add much, but it adds enough. Try and get it as loud as possible. Maybe just do a little bit of gain reduction so that way we're maybe like -3 or -6. There we go. And just create a little automation clip, cut out the very end. And then boom. And yeah, I'll just keep doing this until I'm finished. But yeah, basically that is how you sample in FL Studio. I hope that this video was short, but also informational and helpful to you, especially if you're trying to get into the process of sampling. The biggest key combination that, don't forget it, Alt plus R. Those two keys put together are magical, especially when you have the armed track going. That is essentially how you sample in FL Studio quickly. And yeah, as you can see, like you just keep kind of rinsing through sounds and just really get to the point where you have it sounding exactly the way you want it. And one thing that I didn't really go too much into this video, I tried to a little bit with corrosion and the reverb and stuff like that, but really get creative in this area. Like there's nothing stopping you from changing a sound into something completely different than it originally was. Like have fun with it and get it to the point where you feel like it sounds good to you, like definitely trust your ears and have fun with it. So yeah, with all that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. Please comment, like, subscribe, give me feedback. Let me know what you'd like, dislike, all that kind of good stuff. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you all for watching. Peace.